First. Okay, so I'm glad y'all came to watch this talk today. I'm going to be talking on native foods. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background first on why I'm even talking about native foods, what kind of experiences that I have to do this. First of all, I was a park interpreter at Pecans Archaeological State Park for about 6 years. And when I first got there, I inherited the calendar of events that was already planned for the year. And I started in January, and the calendar of events said that on November something of 2012, I was to offer a native foods event, or a native foods feast. And I thought, well, I don't know what foods were native. So I did a lot of research in the very beginning and dug up an article that was written about the foods that were found at Pecans and in the archaeology, back from the Mississippian period, and learned a lot about the foods that were identified, either the faunal, the animal foods, or the floral, the plant foods. And since I'm not a hunter, but I am a gardener, I learned a lot about the foods by growing them myself in the garden that you see here, which really should have been mowed before I took the picture, so apologize. Or I gathered meat from hunters, and my co-interpreter Ryan did a lot of hunting for us too. So what we did was, for the 6 years that I worked there, every year we made our event larger and larger and larger. And by gathering and growing and hunting and fishing all the different kinds of foodstuffs. And in the process of that, I learned a lot of the way, the hard way, how to do these kinds of, how to process these ingredients, because a lot of them I was completely unfamiliar with. So by the end of the time that I worked at Pecans, we had almost 100 different things on the menu for Koski Foods, which was the name of the event. So basically, most of the information that I've got, and almost all the pictures I have, are from those events. But over the years, I just got more and more creative, and actually more and more comfortable with the ingredients. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about some of those ingredients and my experiences with them. But just a teeny tiny bit of history. The American Indians relied on 3 kinds of foods: the gathered foods, and that was, sort of the very beginnings of the early times, and then hunted and fished foods as well. And then later on in the time periods, they began to grow their foods through horticulture, and then they expanded all the way into very intensive corn agriculture. So they relied on all different types of foods. They had a very varied diet. And I'm going to talk probably more about the gathered foods than anything, only a little teeny tiny bit about the hunted and fished foods, because again, I'm not a hunter or a fisher person, so I wasn't, we didn't get really into the meats. And then I did grow a bunch of food too, so we'll talk about that. So as far as the gathered foods go, there are a lot of things that we are missing in the native diet that you're used to today. So they didn't have any wheat. But they did have other kinds of grains, and which actually first start off as greens and then turn into grains as they're growing and as the season goes through. And the main ones that the grains that the American Indians ate, and by the way, I should back up just a minute. Most of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are things that are found in Arkansas at Pecans specifically, and during the Mississippian time period. So this is, what we call late prehistoric time period, from about 900 to about more like 1200 to 1600 or 1541, which is when DeSoto came through. So we're talking about like the late time period. However, the Mississippian Indians did, even though they had intensive corn agriculture, they still relied on a lot of their gathered foods to complete their diet. So even though these are very, very early foods to begin with, the grains and the greens, they continued on throughout all of the prehistoric time period, and the American Indians utilized all of the things in their environment. So these things nowadays, we normally pull out of our gardens as weeds. So some of the words you recognize, and some of the words are a little bit weirder, but basically all of these things have been found in the archaeology. And I'll show you a couple of pictures of some of them in a second, but they're all really small green things that eventually dry into very teeny tiny grains like mind-numbingly, annoyingly small grains that are very hard to process and keep together. But they're incredibly nutritious, and there was obviously a lot of it. So it did, you know, it was very nutritious. The other type of thing that was gathered was nuts, and the most common ones in Arkansas were the pecans, the black walnuts, the hickory. And I know if there's any tree people out there, I know that a pecan is a hickory, but I'm talking more like the other kinds of hickories with the harder shells, and then the acorns. And because I'm from New Jersey, I say eggcorn and I don't say acorn. So I'm sorry if that's distracting. I get yelled at all the time for saying eggcorn. So, and then the fruits, there was lots of fruits, but the main ones were persimmons, pawpaws, and some of the berries. I'll go over all of those in turn as far as my experiences with them. But first, just one or two of the greens. The lambsquarter, chenopodium, or goosefoot is something that actually grows in the landscape a lot nowadays, but it's not the one that we have now. Is chenopodium album. It's the white goosefoot, and I think that's not necessarily the exact one they had back then. I think the one back then was chenopodium berlandieri. Not that that really matters too much. They're very similar grains or greens, and you can pick this. It's a real small one, and you can pick it and eat it like lettuce when it's or spinach, more like spinach, when it's green, and then you can wait for it to go to seed and then collect the seeds. This was always a fun one because it's very mild tasting. So I was growing it a lot at the visitor center at Parkin, and whenever I had school kids around, we'd just pick it and eat it, and they thought this was the funnest thing in the world to just be able to pick and eat things right off the ground. The other one that I want to show you that was gathered is called amaranth. And this stuff comes in lots of different varieties. You'll see it in people's landscapes nowadays just because it's real pretty. But there's also other versions that are not so pretty, but they all in all, they all make insane amounts of seed. And my picture on the right is not very pretty, but you can see it's a giant amount of seed heads. And the picture top left is just shaking the seeds out. And they're very, very small. But again, so many seeds are very prolific. So it's really useful, again, of course, in the diet. Another one, I wanted to show this one, the Iva annua marshelder, because it's something that's being investigated right now by our former Toltec station archaeologist, Dr. Liz Horton, who is a paleoethnobotanist who has grown this as part of her research at Toltec and continues on. And Katie Gregory is now acting station archaeologist, and she is still continuing to help Liz with this project. And it's a project that lots of folks are doing nationwide to understand the domestication of some of these seeds and seeing them go back to the wild, because now they're back to the wild because we've sort of, obviously they're out of our diet. And so now scientists are trying to understand how things get domesticated and how things don't, or how things go back and how you can re-domesticate stuff. So this is a really neat one that you can see at the gardens at Toltec if you ever get a chance to visit there. Now, as far as the nuts go, I think I'd put them out of order because I'm always more excited about acorns than anything else. Because these things, it's just amazing. I, grew up forever and didn't know you could eat these things. And you probably still shouldn't because they really don't taste very good. But basically the, oops, sorry, I need to go back. I'm messing with my mouse here. So the acorns, red oak generally has more tannic acid in them. The white oak family usually has milder acorns. You can eat both of them, but just for, because I was trying to feed a whole bunch of people that had never had this before, I was more interested in collecting things from the white oak family. The acorns come in all different sizes. My favorite one is called the bur oak. That's not what's pictured here. I think these are sawtooth acorns, which are the red oak family, which are not great, but I had two right on the front lawn at Parkin, so I was always collecting them. But the bur oak is from the white oak family, and they make giant, they almost look like overcup oak acorns, and they're giant ones, and that just gives you more meat quicker. But what I did with these, and by the way, the next picture is not experimental archaeologically accurate, because instead of using the traditional implements that a Native American or American Indian would use to do experimental archaeology to understand exactly how things were going in the past, I gave up with the grindstone and just used my hammer on a piece of cement. and cracked open all the nuts, or the meat nuts, and got them into my Ninja blender. So again, I didn't, I'm not a total purist when it comes to experimental archaeology. I was looking for the ingredients, but not necessarily the mechanism, if you'll allow me to admit that and not get too upset with me. But anyway, you put the nut meat in the blender and blend it up with some water. And then what you need to do, because you can't eat these things like as they are, you need to soak the nut meat in water for many, many days. I think I would start like a month earlier and do this, and I'd have the whole fridge would be filled with these giant jars full of meat, nut meat, and basically you pour off the brown water every day, and that's the tannic acid that goes down the drain, and then you replace it with new water, and every day it gets clearer and clearer and clearer until it's more palatable. It still tastes like dirt, but it's more palatable and obviously good for you to eat because there's no tannic acid in it. And so what you could do is you could use it as is, as far as like a gruel or something. Or what I did was I drained it in cheesecloth. I put it on again, I wasn't going to wait all day and fight off the flies in the sun. So I put it in my dehydrator and dried it into acorn meal. Sometimes I would put it and make acorn flour. So I'd throw it back in the food processor. And sometimes I would just use it as is. So it depends on what you're going to do with it. If you're going to make acorn bread, or if you're going to try to make some kind of a porridge with it. It needs something though, because honestly, it doesn't taste great, but I think it's our palate that's not used to those things either. So incredibly nutritious. Lots and lots of acorn shells have been found at all archaeological sites in the Southeast. So we know that it was a very important protein. The next nut is black walnuts, and probably a lot of you are familiar with black walnuts, but they're not English walnuts, so they're very hard to get out of the shell. They start off as, apple looking things, but you let them dry out a little bit more. Most people run them over with their cars in their driveway, but I didn't have a driveway to do that on that I couldn't stain. So I basically stepped on each one of them and got all the husks off. But of course, the husks are a very dark black dye, which I then used for my natural dye workshop eventually. So just if you're ever going to try to do anything with these things, note that you should probably be wearing gloves. But basically, you get all the husk off, and then you've got these, these nuts that are incredibly hard to crack. But it's a sort of a delicacy. A lot of people love them. And again, walnuts have been found, the shells have been found in the archaeology. Another one, like I'd mentioned, is hickory nuts, and wagons full of hickory nuts and wagons full of pecans at Parkin that we would sit in all hours of the day and collect and then crush at the front desk at the visitor center. So there'd be nutshells all over the place through October and November, and we'd constantly be sweeping them up. But the pecans are my favorite because they are easy to crack, and they're sweet and they're delicious. And those are ones, again, that would be collected for our Native Foods event, but also we know that it was utilized a lot in the archaeology. And so you got this picture here is just a fun historic, kind of antique nut pecan cracker. It's like long shaped for the shape of the pecan. So you can get one. I think I got on eBay or something like that. As far as the fruits go, the persimmon is the most fantastic fruit in the whole wide world, as long as you haven't been abused by one of your fellow friends or your family members when you were a kid and they tried to make you eat a persimmon that was not ripe. Because if it's not ripe and you chew on it, or even if you get it close to your mouth, it will make your face turn inside out. And it is so unpleasant that a lot of people are ruined for life about these persimmons, because if they get it when it's not, ripe, it's terrible. But when they are ripe, they are like candy. And but they're also very sticky. So when you try to process them down, you've got to clean all of your equipment. Otherwise, it like turns into cement after it dries. So a persimmon should look like this. It shouldn't actually. This picture here that I stole from the internet, those are probably okay, but really I would go a little step further and let them look like this. I know they're ugly like this, but that means they're really ripe. And A lot of people say that you have to wait for the first frost in order for them to be ripe enough, but that's not true. As soon as they hit the ground, if you check them, some of them still hit the ground when they're not ripe. But if they look like this and there's not like, you know, bugs crawling all over them, this is where you want to eat them. But I've also learned, I have a good sense of smell, I guess, and I was able to tell rotten from good, from not rotten. So even though those look rotten, I promise you every one of them was good, at least according to my nose, and everybody seems to like them. So anyway, so persimmons were talked about in the DeSoto Chronicles. When DeSoto came through, they mentioned they didn't use the word persimmon specifically, but researchers have figured out that they think they were talking about persimmons as dry persimmon cakes. Like it seems like they would sort of dry them out and use them as trade. This was one of the few very sweet things available to the American Indians back then. There were no honeybees, okay? There were bumblebees, but bumblebees don't make a lot of honey. So that was something that very rarely someone would be able to taste. So persimmon was really one of the sweetest things. Even the berries they had, which I'll show you a couple, are not as sweet as persimmon. So this is like candy. And some of the things that I'd love to do with it is push it through this cone strainer and get all the pulp out, because there's very big seeds in them. And the skin is, you know, a little bit, not terribly tough, but it's just nicer to have a really nice pulp to use for things like in the top right of this picture, the persimmon pulp. And you can add it to things to sweeten it. But one of my favorite things to do with it is put it on that food dehydrator and make persimmon leather. Or I had to start calling it dried persimmon, because when we put it out for our event, people would be like, I don't want to eat leather. Because people weren't thinking fruit leather, they were thinking of leather, and then I had to change the name. So it turned into, I'm not a good marketer, you know. So anyway, so persimmon fruit leather is like a fruit roll up, okay? And it's totally delicious with nothing added to it. Just flat it out on there, and it's just beautifully and wonderful, delicious. Another native fruit that is a little bit elusive is the pawpaw. And it tastes like a mixture between a mango and a banana, and it's very squishy. So a lot of people don't like the custardy taste of it or the feel of it texture wise, but they're amazing. And we also find, of course, pawpaw seeds in the archaeology, and that's how we know that they were being used as food. And then for the berries, there's elderberry, and this is not an easy food to process because there's so many teeny tiny ones on each of these drupes. And so pulling them off is really like not efficient. So you could juice it, but it's not very sweet. But we do know, you know, just through our research, and most people probably know that it's a really good like antioxidant or something. And like people take elderberry now for health. Okay, so this was probably something that was added, not necessarily as a taste, but well, again, the palates were different. So it might have been, I mean, it's still an interesting taste. It just wasn't sweet. Okay, so don't think you're gonna put one of these in your mouth and get sweet. But it does make a nice, and it makes a nice dye, by the way. I know we're talking about food, but makes a real nice dye. And then another one, serviceberry, is something that we find in the archaeological record as seeds again. And these things look kind of like blueberries, but they don't get quite as blue. They get a little bit darker red, but they're really nice, and they are pretty sweet, relatively speaking. So those are real nice. And there was a few of those growing at Parkin in big trees of them, you know, not just a little bush. I mean, there's a big tree at Parkin that I was able to pick from, and I had to fight off the cedar waxwings every year for these things. So they're a favorite fruit of cedar waxwings. So if you have them, expect to have some cedar waxwings in your yard. Finally, this wasn't really gathered, but it was just when we had our foods event, I always felt like we had to have some sort of a drink to go along with it instead of just water. So I learned about pine needle tea, and it's an interesting taste. You know, I mean, just think about pine, the smell of pine in water. We cheated and sometimes added honey to it, but you know, it's still a nutritious thing. It's got a lot of niacin in it, as from what I understand. But all right, so that was the gathered foods. The hunted, like I said, I'm going to go real quick over this, but this list is not an exhaustive list of what the American Indians were eating. They were eating, you know, anything that's edible was probably eaten. However, at Parkin, the amount of animal remains that were found are listed here from the most to the least, and then there were lots of other ones, but this is sort of the general list of the more common foods that were hunted and fished. Now, there were no domesticated animals in the prehistoric time period, except for the dog, but that probably wasn't often on the menu. So the deer, of course, was a really high protein thing, and there are lots of studies that are very interesting that show switches from reliance on deer to reliance on fish as the time periods went on. Getting off topic a little bit, but it's a very interesting thing that faunal analysts do, is figure out like what was eaten more and which was targeted more, and maybe it also has something to do with environment and population and stuff like that. So, but anyway, these are the common ones that you'd find, and probably none of them are surprising to you. The top ones are ones that we did experiment with. I didn't do anything with turtle because they're just too cute, but the other ones, we had some of each of that. I didn't have the beaver either, but these other ones we got and experimented with this, and we made, we roasted some of the meat. We made stews out of some of the meat. We don't know exactly how the food was composed. But just like kind of thinking about, you'd want to add, some meat with some kind of protein, like beans to go with it. And I think we added like squash and threw some of the service berries in with the squash. We just kind of experimented with different tastes and stuff. And also, of course, beef jerky or venison jerky. We would try to not just have salted, but also I put some cedar in there to try to get a different taste. And so that was fun to just try to go with different tastes and flavors to try to figure out if there was any other way to do things without too many spices back then. But the main thing that was done with the jerky is something that I always want to make sure people understand what this is. It's called pemmican. And pemmican is a very important food even nowadays for American Indians, because it's a very historic food that was really important to folks when they were having to trade and move around and go on hunting expeditions and leave home for a while, where they wouldn't necessarily have all of the stored foods that they had access to. And this was basically like a trail mix. So what I did, again, I cheated. I tell you what, I would go door to door and sell Ninja blenders, because I put that venison jerky in the Ninja blender and it turned it into a beautiful powder like immediately. So that powder, that meat powder, I would add berries and I added butter, but obviously you'd want to add like bear fat to it and stick it all together and make it into a granola bar, but it was shelf stable. And folks, even settlers were using this, Europeans were using this kind of idea to travel long distances. And then there was also a vegetarian pemmican, corn pemmican, that was made with cornmeal and berries and lard, or I used butter because that makes everything better. So that was an important food, not the most tasty thing for my palate, but like I said, incredibly important. That was it for the meat. Like I said, I wasn't going to talk too much about the meat, but the grown foods is a whole other topic that was very interesting. And a lot of folks are very familiar with the concept of the three sisters, the corn, beans, and the squash. Again, this is sort of a late prehistoric thing, because corn didn't come into the picture until about 1,000 years ago. So this isn't, a very long-term vegetable that was used, but towards the end it was a very important one because it allowed for large population growth because it was so productive. But the corn, beans, and squash together worked in two ways, very useful ways. One known to the American Indians, and one probably I understood, but not chemically understood. So the first part is the three sisters work together because the corn acts as a trellis for the beans, and then the squash spreads out on the ground and creates a mulch so that weeds don't grow up around the other two sisters. So and there's, whole creation stories about this, and it was a very important concept for many, many cultures throughout the prehistory of the Southeast. Also, the chemically speaking, it makes a complete food. So the three things together can make a very important nutritional triplex. And it also tends to work because the corn and the beans do different things with the soil. So even for the gardening people out there, the beans set nitrogen into the soil while the corn takes it out. So they work together as good companion crops. I'll talk about those three in turn to show you how I grew them. Oh, but the picture on the bottom right is really the ideal situation where you really do get all three sisters together. I couldn't get my three sisters to work out. They were always catty with each other. And I always wound up with the beans pulling the corn down, and they'd get into knockout, drag out fights, and I couldn't make it work. So I actually did separate them in the garden because they couldn't get along. And the squash was always trying to get over the fence. So she was always trying to leave anyway. So it didn't work out for me, but I know other people who have had luck growing all three right together in the same plot. And it's really beautiful when it works. I just couldn't make my sisters work out together. But also sunflowers were a food that actually you don't think about as a food, but I'll explain it in a second. And then the something that a lot of you may be familiar with because it spreads like crazy, but you didn't know you could eat it, is a Jerusalem artichoke, or what we call sunchoke. I'll show you a picture of that in a second too. Basically, all of these right here are really good for storage. So they last a long time after you pick them. You can dry them, or as in the case of squash, it can last a really long time if it's not bruised. So let's just look at all three of these. Okay, now everybody knows what corn looks like, but a lot of people, and honestly, I shouldn't say a lot of people, I didn't know that I just didn't know, I guess. I didn't realize that you grew corn not just for sweet corn in the can or corn on the cob. Like, corn is a grain, right? So, and I didn't realize I wasn't thinking about people growing it for their livestock and stuff, right? But it turns out after lots of trial and error, I figured out that you grow corn and it's dry. A lot of the varieties are dry when you grow them. So you have to, let them go the full season and let them go completely dry and ugly. And then it's when you pick them. So my first year I got bad pollination, but I was able to grow some fun stuff, a dent corn called Bloody Butcher. The bottom right is just the bad pollination. So if any gardeners out there get this ugly corn, it's because it just hasn't been pollinated right. But I grew the beloved glass gem popcorn. A lot of people have heard about this one. It was like opening a Christmas present every single time you open that, because you have no idea what color it's going to be. Most beautiful thing ever, but it is a popcorn. So this was the early stages. I really thought I could just bite into this stuff. I almost broke my teeth because it actually grows hard. And another one called Flora del Rio Popcorn. It was really beautiful too. And so, corn comes in tons of varieties, and of course all of it's edible, but you have to do different things to it. The dent corn wants to be, it's hard, so you have to grind it down into meal. The popcorn is even harder. So you really just want to pop it. And then there's all different other kinds of ones. The sweet corn is pretty rare, actually. And I learned, again, the hard way. I didn't read up on it, and I dried all the corn, like totally dry, for a month and a half after I harvested it, and then not a single one of it popped. Or maybe one cob popped, and the rest of it was too dried out. So I learned you got to put that corn right in the freezer so you can store it so that it doesn't dry out. There's got to be some moisture in the popcorn itself before, so you can pop it. Otherwise, you can grind it and make corn cakes out of it. There's lots of different corn cake recipes and things that people would grind up the corn for. But probably the most wonderful thing that you can do with corn is make hominy. And a lot of people have had experience with hominy out of a can, and it's not the most pleasant thing in the world. But it turns out that if you make hominy from scratch, even though it's hard to do, it's much more worth it, because it has a most wonderful taste, different than any canned hominy you could ever get. And the hominy also has a wonderful story behind it, that it was probably a recipe, or a technique, I should say, passed down through families. And it was something that was probably always cooking on the hearth. That was a snack, that people could eat. So not only was it, just a regular food stuff, but there's ideas behind it that it was actually not, I mean, I guess you can call it a comfort food. I don't want to totally, you know, make it like what we would think of it as today, but it was a thing that was probably passed down through families, and an important part of, you know, gathering around the hearth and having that food. So I've made this not in a clay pot. This is not my picture. Dr. Rachel Briggs from North Carolina let me borrow this picture, and but it's just something that you should try if you ever get a chance to make it, because it is a very long and tedious process, but worthwhile because it is an amazing taste. If you want to ask me questions about hominy later, I can answer questions. Beans. Most of us are used to green beans, but the beans we're talking about were beans that you wait until they get totally dry and ugly, and then you pop them out of the shell, and then you have them forever and ever. Not ever and ever, because if it's like a year or two old and they're dry, it's going to be harder for them to get soft. But suffice it to say, you can grow a lot of these things, and they can last a long time and be very important for the hungry time. You know, the hungry time was February, March, right before the spring stuff started coming out. So these are really important things to have to last through the winter. It used to get cold here in Arkansas in the winter, and so there really wouldn't be things available to them come December, January, February. So these things were very important to set aside. Now the squash. There was lots of squashes, but none of them were probably the soft yellow squash, summer squash, or zucchini squash that we're used to today. Most of them were the hard squashes, the winter squashes, we call them. Not because they grow in the winter, but because they last through the winter, and they're usually hard shelled. This one that I found is called the kashaw, and I had to put a sign next to them because people were stealing my kashaw because they were so big. And remember I told you that the squash sister liked to climb out the fence. So she was always hanging out outside the fence of the garden, and people would come and take them because they were so ridiculously big. They were like larger than two babies, these squashes were. They were huge. They were fantastic and had really nice orange meat inside of them. And the thing about them, I did some experimenting with them. I just kind of left them for like a year on the floor, just in the visitor center at Parkin. And you know what? We cut those things open a year later, and they were still perfectly fine to eat. So not only do these things get you through the hungry time, these things get you through the second hungry time, probably. So they're really amazing. And these ones, for any gardeners out there, are supposedly not immune, but it's harder for the squash vine borer to get them. I don't know exactly what it is, but it is, you know, since it's a native, we know that growing natives is always going to be better because they're adapted for our environment. So anyway, if you want to look up the kashaw, it's an amazing squash, and they're giant, and they'll feed your whole family for forever. So grow them. With the squash, you know, what do you do with squash? Obviously, people would just probably bake them. I dried some, so the top right-hand picture there's dried squash flakes. You can make bread out of them, not any kind of yeast bread, but, you know, just like a cake almost. Sunflowers. Here's the story with sunflowers. Most people, you know, think about sunflowers because they're beautiful. But a lot, and farmers, we know, the farmers know that you can get oil out of the sunflowers. That's why they grow them. That's why sometimes you see large fields of sunflowers, but they're not these ones. They're these ones, really big sunflowers. They're ginormous sunflowers that I grew. These things were like 12 feet tall. There were like squirrels would like almost fall to their deaths when they were trying to get these things out of the, you know, get the seeds out. Here's me for size for some of these sunflowers. So big sunflowers. And what was going on was you're growing these things for the seed, and you're getting it for the oil. Now, most of the time we don't want oil in our diets now. We're always trying to get fat-free stuff. But the fact of the matter is that all of the foods that were grown and gathered, hardly anything had too much fat in it. And the animals were all hunted. So they were all wild animals, and there was hardly any fat in any one of them except for the bear. And the bear wasn't like, you know, high up on the list. So they really needed fat in their diet. And this is where they got it, from smashing down sunflower seeds and possibly floating the oil up to the top in a thing of water and then collecting the oil. So really important crop there. And again, it was those mammoth sunflowers that were probably being grown. The last grown thing I wanted to mention was the sunchoke or the Jerusalem artichoke. These things are, you know, they're on the landscape. They're wild in Arkansas. I see them. They flower late in the year. They flower in like October. And they most people don't realize you can eat them. But basically, when they dry out, when the stalks go dry and they go dormant, or well, no, they don't go dormant, they die. You pull them out of the ground and you get, oh, by the way, there's a flower. That's what a sunchoke flower looks like. You pull them out and underneath there's a root. It's, I think, one of the only starches known to early America, North America, I should say, because the potatoes came from South America, but it's a starch. Okay, I know it looks like Asian ginger, but it is not. They look just like it, but it's a completely different. It's a starch like a potato. We had wheelbarrows full of them, and they're not very pleasant to clean, just because they got so many undulations and stuff in them. So you have to have a good brush to clean these things, and they are just a starch, so you can roast them. You can eat them raw, but just a warning, when you eat them raw, sometimes people call them fartichokes. I'll move on. You can also slice them really thin and grind it up, and it actually is a base for like gumbo filet. Like it'll thicken your soups. So I did a lot of throwing it on the mandolin and slicing it real thin and drying it and then grinding it down, or making chips. So there's, they're kind of a versatile thing. They don't have much of a taste, but they are, again, nutritious for the starch. So I think that I'm going to stop there. And here's my email address for anybody that wants to contact me about anything. But I also wanted to mention three, to me, important resources. Now, I'm sure there's tons of native foods resources out there, but the one that I actually learned a lot from, especially the acorn processing, was from Hank Shaw. He's out in California. He's just sort of a interesting guy that runs a hunt, gather, cook blog, and you should, if you want to learn, he has all the processes on his blog of how he does things. So that was really helpful. Not quite a survivalist, more of like a naturalist kind of person that experiments with lots of different foods. So I learned a lot from him. And then I also learned a lot about sort of modern cooking, but also hearkening back to some of the native ingredients by a guy named Sean Sherman, who's a Lakota from South Dakota, and he's known as the Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X, haha. And he's got a fantastic book out called Indigenous Kitchen, and he also, he's out in Minnesota now, and he does catering business, and he goes around and him and his team educate folks about using native ingredients and the history of things and stuff like that. So he's fantastic. And then closer to home, we actually have a Choctaw who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer named Dr. Ian Thompson. And he has a book that I still need to get called Choctaw Food. And it looks like a fantastic history of more Southeastern ingredients as opposed to the Northern ingredients like Sean Sherman has. So I wanted to point you out to those three because I think they're really useful, and you can learn a lot and about the history of the use of these foods, because it's not just about experimenting and having fun with these things. It's understanding like how they work nutritionally, how historically they're important to people, and I think it's just a really fascinating thing to learn about. So I hope that you get in touch with me and look at these resources.